Weaker figures than expected were released by the Office for National Statistics, showed GDP growth of just 0.2% in the first quarter of this year. But at least the economy is still growing. That's just half the 0.4% figure for the previous quarter, which saw the country finally lift out of recession. A similar rise had been forecast for this quarter. But this is just the first estimate. It's based on only 40% of the data, and over the next 2 months that figure will be revised twice, which will give a better indication of just how strong the recovery is going. But it is, on the face of it, looking pretty weak at best. Now, I think we can join Nick Parsons now, who is the head of markets strategy for National Australia Bank. And he joins us live from the city. Mr. Parsons, your take.
Well, Joel, they were pretty much in line with our own guesses. We were pencilling in 0.3, but we'd been stressing the downside risks to that number, particularly after yesterday's retail sales figures. So 0.2 is a disappointment to many people. It's broadly in line with what we were thinking, but it does highlight the fragility of the UK's economic position. And I think we're going to be subject to an enormous amount of spinning over the next couple of hours as everyone tries to make their own policy positions on this a little bit clearer. But on the face of it, I think these are disappointing numbers.